All right. Welcome to the Conflict Consortium Virtual Workshop with Erica Chenoweth and myself as co-hosts. Today we are discussing social networks, protests, and repression by Shane Steinert-Threlkeld and Zachary Steinert. Younger or older?
He's younger.
Yeah. Okay, we'll go into that maybe later on as well. Yuri will get us started. Please introduce yourself once you kind of like begin, and then you're off.
Oh, hi everybody. I'm Yuri Zhukov with the Political Science Department at the University of Michigan, and I have the pleasure of commenting on Zach and Shane's paper about network model scaling, and what the authors are trying to do in this paper is connect two well-known properties of networks and protests. So it's well known in the network literature that degree distributions in social networks tend to be distributed power law. There's been some recent literature by Aaron Clauset, Cosmo Shalizi, and others that protest size may also be distributed power law, and they argue that these two things are related. The goal of this paper, as they note, is to clarify the generative process behind protests. And they do so through computational modeling. They have a network model in which they explore how equilibrium protest size varies as a function of several network parameters, and particularly how the number of well-connected individuals in the network, the level of repression that the government uses, and a few other parameters of interest. I really enjoyed reading this paper. I thought it was a very interesting approach. I think there is a demand for more creative computational modeling approaches like this in the literature. I think this approach potentially has a lot to add. But in the comments that I'm about to give of this, I'm going to try to red team this a little bit, and I'm going to read this paper from the standpoint of someone who may be inherently not very receptive to this kind of work. And so, for instance, a lot of game theorists have well-known biases against agent-based modeling just on principle. But there are also quite a few conflict scholars who may take issue with some of the conclusions that you draw from this model, and I want to flesh that out a little bit as well. So as I see it, the main overarching issue in this paper is a lack of a clear parsimonious result. You have a lot of results that you obtain from the model, and it's just you overwhelm us with these results. It's not clear which of these we should care about most. So, for instance, why should we care about nonlinear changes in the correlation between neighborhood size and equilibrium protest size? What does this actually tell us about protests? And the main takeaway, some would argue, is theoretically unsatisfying, because what you have here is this overarching claim that there's this fundamental randomness to the growth of protest movements. And these things are very hard to predict. And due to all these nonlinearities and null relationships that you find, it's very hard to draw a clear parsimonious conclusion from all of this. And the conclusions that you do draw, particularly about the repression-dissent nexus, essentially that repression has no effect, that protests are random. It has the unique property of being both sweeping in the scope of this conclusion, and also some would argue that it's not really commensurate with the amount of evidence that you currently have as a result of these numerical simulations. Now, as regards the setup of the model, you're well aware, I'm sure, of the standard critique of computational modeling, that it's hard to make general conclusions from numerical simulations. You're exploring, a particular solution rather than a general solution. And what was missing here, I thought, was just a justification for why numerical simulation is appropriate here. Is this system so complex that you cannot model it analytically? You cannot derive an analytical solution from which you can then derive comparative statics and then make conclusions that are a little bit less narrow. There's also the standard critique of models like this, that the actors here are not strategic. The level of repression is exogenous to initial protest size. Initial protest size itself is exogenous to expected levels of repression. The threshold is constant for each individual. The actors, in a sense, are just automatons. They're behaving deterministically according to a fixed set of decision rules. There's a whole literature on evolutionary game theory that does look at games on graphs and network games that tries to incorporate these kinds of strategic decision rules, where a lot of that work is analytical, but there are simulation approaches as well. Some Martin Novak's work, some of Dave Rand's work, and others could potentially be instructive here. While I don't necessarily advise that you go in that direction, this is at least a literature that has to be acknowledged as to justify why you're making the assumptions that you are about how people make their choices. That they're not taking the others, the protesters are not taking the government's actions into account, and vice versa. But partly as a result of this lack of strategic optimization, you're potentially exploring areas of the parameter space where rational actors are unlikely to go. So, like, why would a government repress at a low level if it expects protests to grow exponentially? There may well be a good explanation for this, but with the simulations that you currently have, it'd be nice to know at least which areas of this parameter space are we're most likely to encounter in the real world. And there are other assumptions as well that I don't necessarily think need to be changed, but need to be justified a little bit more, such as this whole idea that the government targets protesters with 100% accuracy, does not target non-protesting individuals at all, that the same level of repression is applied to all protesters, irregardless of how well connected they are. And this idea that individuals learn of protest size only through first order connections and not indirect ties. That if I'm cut off from my contacts due to government repression, there's no way that I can learn about what my friend is doing through friends of friends. Then there's a whole issue of empirical validation that it kind of seems like like you try to seed the model with parameter values from empirical networks, but you don't make it absolutely clear where these parameters come from. So like this whole gamma of 2.3, which I think is from Barabasi 1999, from the original paper that found that social networks have this power law distribution and the degree distribution. But you don't mention that. You basically say things like, well, real social networks have a gamma of 2. So just some additional justification there would be nice. I mean, the results are obviously not tested with empirical data. You have some examples at the end, which you throw out there kind of as stylized facts, not all of which I think are useful. So the Rick Santelli example of how the Tea Party movement got started directly contradicts your assumption that basically social networks are the primary means by which people learn protest size. I mean, that spark to the Tea Party movement, as far as I can recall, was driven by traditional media. He was saying these things on CNBC. It's also not clear what 9/11 has to do with any of this, which you mentioned. I think in terms of the parameterization of the model, besides justifying parameter values with claims that you just basically need to back up with some footnotes, I did not find anything necessarily problematic with removing edges as a way to model repression. I think that's a pretty clever way to do this. I think that not all repression works like that, but a lot of it does, and I think that's an innovative contribution that you're making. But again, the main issue I had with this is the uniformity of repression. Why, if a government knows that certain individuals are much more influential than others, why would it repress all protesters rather than just targeting those right there? So for example, Navalny in Russia, very influential guy, put him under house arrest, but gag order, put his brother in prison as they say as collateral. But they're not going after every single protester. They're going after highly influential ones that are likely to make a splash in social media. And as I wrap up, the main barrier, I think, to presenting these results in a parsimonious way is really a matter of presentation rather than substance. I understand this is a first draft, but at times I've found it pretty hard to read. I think a lot of this will be resolved just by thorough proofreading. But there's also just a lot of jargon here. A lot of it is undefined. You don't really define what fat tails are until about halfway through the paper. You use some terms interchangeably. Sometimes alpha parameter for the degree distribution, you call it network scaling. Sometimes you call it something else. And I think just the presentation of the model's results need to be translated from kind of the logic of discovery, which right now is kind of like a play-by-play of the modeling process. Like, we ran these simulations, this is what we found. It needs to be translated into the logic of presentation. What do these things actually tell us about protests? Connect these results to clear theoretical propositions that you establish before you even get into how the model is set up. And also just like, who is the audience for this paper? So I think most political scientists will have no idea what a scale-free network is. Those who do will ask, well, what is new about this? It's been known for about 20 years that no degrees are distributed power law. You do not need a computational model to prove that this property has downstream effects on how things spread through the network. And as I said before, a lot of political scientists, and I'll defer to Christian and Erica on this, but I feel like a lot of people will take issue with the conclusions that you draw from this. So this whole idea that occasionally the right configuration of people will mobilize, and they will be connected in just such a way that mobilization spreads far and quickly. So the idea here is that protest growth is essentially random and somewhat indeterminate, and also responses to repression are random. So this is going to alienate all game theorists who study repression. It flies in the face of a lot of empirical evidence on the to the contrary. The fact that there are conflicting findings about the repression-dissent nexus are not evidence that there's an underlying null relationship, but more likely that there's a conditional relationship there that may have been unmodeled to date. And if protest is indeed fundamentally unpredictable, what does this mean? What does this mean for the rest of us who are studying these things? Should we stop trying to predict them? Should the government stop trying to fund forecasting projects that try to model where civil unrest is likely to unfold? On slightly more minor points, some of the figures are a little hard to interpret. So the complementary CDF in Figure 1. I mean, this will be clear for people who looked at how power law distributions work in the real world. But I mean, a lot of people will wonder, what the heck is this sudden change in slope at the end? What does it become a vertical line? And make clear that's presumably due to finite sample properties. But
Yuri, let's hold on your minor point for a second.
All right. Okay.
Exactly.
I will resist.
You have the time, Zach. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Yuri, thanks for the close read. These are all really good comments and reveal that you've thought about this closely, and I think are indicative of the issues I'll need to address to get this into publication form. So I took notes on everything you said. I'll try to respond to what I see as the main points. And if I miss anything, just let me know. So I think I'll start first with numeric versus analytic approaches, and then go to how I present the results, and then how that leads into kind of the why should we care, and who the audience is. So there are two main reasons why I chose to simulate as opposed to do a formal model. The first primary, frankly, is pragmatic. I'm not strong at all in formal modeling, and I don't really know anyone in this space who is. Not, I mean, there are people, but they're not people that I have like a professional relationship with, and so it was just easier to start this with simulations. And then once I decided to go the simulation route, I should say as well, I noticed from just doing my previous work on the Arab Spring and then some subsequent stuff, like it's clear to me that there are nonlinear relationships in protest size and determinants of protest size. And so it was much more intuitive for me to simulate that than to analytically derive that. And so then once I settled on simulating, I intentionally kept the model very simple, precisely to be able to explore the parameter space. So in fact, there are only two real parameters that I vary, right? The network scaling /alpha/gamma. I agree. I need to probably use just one word for that, but it's only that and the repression rate, so that I can visualize that on a two-dimensional space, right on a paper. Because all the critiques of simulations about having unexplored parameter space and being too complicated to understand what's going on are correct. I agree with that, and I think you have to be very careful presenting in the simulation results when the simulation has more than two parameters that vary. So that's why, for example, I don't have the state target individuals for oppression based on any characteristics of the individuals, because that's then another parameter that I could vary. That's why the state perfectly targets individuals, because then if I say then they have a 50% accuracy or 80% accuracy, that's another parameter I have to vary. So the concerns you raise about how I model repression are accurate, but I chose to not do that specifically to keep the results interpretable, to make the parameter space as small as possible while still capturing what I think are the key dynamics driving protest and repression. So that, for example, is why the actors are not strategic, and why I gave everyone a constant threshold. So in work I've done on this paper since then, because I submitted this a couple months ago. I do take different. I do not use a constant threshold. So either they are drawn randomly from a normal distribution or a uniform distribution, which in a way does introduce many more degrees of freedom that I would have to inspect. But for each simulation, they all, the distribution that the threshold is drawn from is the same. So anyway, the constant threshold is not something that I'm wed to, because that by varying that threshold, if I make it 1, then the protest never happens. If I make it 0, then repression never has an effect. So that's on simulation and game theory.
Sorry, Zach, sorry to interrupt. I meant constant with respect to time, that for each individual, once that random draw is made, that over t = 1, t = 2,
okay,
that stays the same.
Yeah, okay, got it. Yeah, to be honest, I didn't think about that at all. But again, just, all these issues complicate, are certainly more realistic, but then they also make the simulation more complicated and therefore harder to interpret. So the people I know best who've done simulations, they explicitly call them agent-based models, are Lars Eric in his early work on state size, and David Siegel, where he has ABMs of protest and repression. And they both have a lot of parameters, and have both told me that they face very strong pushback in the review process, because it's hard to convince people that they're presenting generalizable results and not just something in particular to the parameter space. And so I took that to heart again when constructing the model. So now let's see, what was presentation. So the takeaway is supposed to be that as the severity of repression increases, the fat-tailedness of the protest distribution gets smaller, disappears, right? You're not going to have large protests. And as the fat-tailedness of network connectiveness decreases, as you have fewer and fewer very well-connected people, the fat-tailedness of protest will decrease. And so that's supposed to be the main takeaway. And that you're right that doesn't come until later. I mean, that's really experiment 3. And as I presented it, I'm building up to the more and more complicated model, which is experiment 3, and that's where that result comes. So I think I should make that more clear. Maybe only present experiment 3, but that's the main result, and that's what I want to be the main takeaway. In terms of jargon and presenting. Yeah, so I struggled with like when to define fat tails. I intentionally avoided or tried to minimize the use of words like power law and scale free. I thought fat tail was a little more commonplace, but if you think it needs to be more rigorously defined, I could. I mean, frankly, I originally started off before saying this out, writing like scale free and power law, but I thought that was too specific. Because I don't think the result is contingent on degree distribution being distributed according to a power law. I think you could have a log normal or exponential distribution of them so long as the variance is very large. But the power law lets me model this variance with just one parameter, gamma / alpha / network scaling, as opposed to having to give a mean and variance for the other distributions if it was log normal or exponential. Yeah, so, and I do use alpha, gamma, and network scaling interchangeably. That's just stylistic preference because I like to use synonyms. But if you think that that's confusing, then I'll certainly choose one of those and just stick with it. Who is the audience and what the takeaway should be? I mean, the audience is us, right? Like I'm not writing this for PLOS One or for Barabashi or Classe, right? I want to write this for political science journals and conflict scholars. So if that's not clear, then that's something that I'll take to heart and that I'll work on. But then what the takeaway should not be so nihilistic. I mean, this is certainly something that I've struggled with because I think these things, especially as I was starting this a few months ago. But I do think that these outcomes are very noisy, and the data generating process is highly contextual and highly nonlinear, and our data to date and even currently I don't think are complex enough, are detailed enough to capture what's going on. So the outcome appears as though it is random, even though it probably is not specifically random. And I came to this from thinking about like the Arab Spring, where a random fruit vendor lights himself on fire, and then we have a Syrian civil war that's now led to Brexit and Trumpism and whatever. But the point is simply, right, like the Mohammed Bouazizi was not the first person to immolate in Tunisia. After he immolated, there were copycat immolations in Algeria and Egypt way before their quote unquote Arab Spring protests. I'm blanking on other examples right now. I've like started detailing these in a separate note, but the point is simply like the start of protests seems quite random, and then sometimes, you know, very large scale repression leads to protests decreasing, and sometimes it doesn't, right? So I'm thinking about like, you know, Myanmar in 1988, China in 1989. So on the other hand, East Germany in 1989, I guess did not have large scale repression. Anyway, I think, you know, the randomness could be just that you know, everything is highly conditional and we haven't specified our models correctly. But I think at the current state of play that you know, I'm not convinced that, you know, we're close to getting there and to pushing the randomness back. And so I'm trying to provide an explanation for why that may be. I think the work I find most convincing is like Gartsky's Wars in the Error Term, and then actually Jay and Erica's it was the 2014 or 2015 piece about determinants of I think, you know, was mass mobilization or protest. I forget the specific DV, but looking at these structural variables and trying to predict the onset. And you know, the R squared was pretty decent. But they essentially do what Eric was talking about, where they say, well, we can figure out these kind of structural things that make the occurrence, the outbreak of a mobilization more likely. And then their paper wasn't asking, then, you know, once this starts, what happens after that? That's kind of the work that I've been doing, and it's, you know, it's very difficult to figure out these day-to-day dynamics. So anyway, I'll stop there, and I guess we can start the conversation.
Erica, jump in with something.
Yeah, well, I'll just pick up on that last bit that you mentioned, Zach, about like, what question are you most interested in answering? In part because I think the way the paper opens, it opens as if the primary motivation for the project is basically fitting the data to different types of potential distributions, where actually what you do is you specify parameters from which you develop an ABM, and you seem to be interested in substantive questions, right? And the one that you just pointed out is this puzzle of why sometimes initial salvos of protests are met with repression, and that repression mobilizes further protest, whereas other times it demobilizes the protest. And so I think that puzzle remains in the literature. And so that in itself, if you sort of open from the substantive question instead of from the sort of data distribution question, I think that it might be clearer, you know, what your key takeaway is at the end as well. And yeah, it's also helpful to sort of think about the so what aspect, right? So if you're trying to hook your reader right away into why they should read all this math, I think that, you know, the clear answer is because, you know, these agent-based models can do things that honestly large-scale observational data sets have not been able to do, in part because we don't have great statistical modeling yet for observational data that takes into account things like, you know, mutual interdependence, heterogeneous units, and the like. And we have lots of endogeneity, we have lots of simultaneity bias, we have lots of underreporting in observational data. You know, there's all kinds of things that we can't do with the statistical analyses, and that then also helps motivate, you know, the methodological approach that you use here. So I think that might be a way to help focus the study in a way that deals with both the substantive and methodological contributions you're making.
Great. You know, so Yuri also mentioned any you know, tests or empirics aside from these stylized facts. I've started to try to get at that. I started doing this maybe in February or early March. I had some breather space. Anyway, so right, because I have a ton of geolocated Twitter data, and so I can actually, and I know the number of followers of people, so I can get the network scaling in a country. And the harder part though is to get the scaling of protest. ACLED only reports like casualties and fatalities. CCC is just the U.S. There's all the UCDP stuff, but that again is hard for participation. So right now I'm kind of stuck there on the testing. Trying to find a good measure of size that also is internet, that applies to many countries.
I think SCAD would be your best bet, actually.
But that's
so for Africa and Latin America.
Yeah, but it's just logarithmic though. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Yeah, you'd have to rescale the participation.
Yeah, I think so. Right now, what I'm thinking is like talking nicely to people with all these individual projects. So like I'm blanking. Asimoglu and two co-authors. They have something about Egypt from 2011 to 2013. Kletchley at somewhere in England has Egypt data. I saw someone on the Monkey Cage post stuff about participation in Israeli protests. You're right. Like right now, I just email people when I see these things and try to get data that way. Because I'm just not aware of any large scale database that kind of has participation.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Christian.
You had something directly on point.
Yeah, so the only other data I can recommend that's can just come online is the NAVCO3 data, which it isn't like a representative set of countries, but it's 21 countries from 1990 to 2013, and it has all events, all reported events and state responses, and it has participation rates whenever they're available. So, and I think there are over 100,000 observations in it. So
yeah, so I've used that NAVCO data for a separate project about scaling where anyway, not important here, but I've looked at that, and then the problem with that is that my Twitter data doesn't start until 2013, so it doesn't overlap with my network scaling. I've talked to Camber Warren about whether we could use his data on cell phone penetration as maybe like a proxy kind of for network scaling. And so we might go that way and then combine that with NAVCO. But anyway, for this specific paper, the problem is that I don't have my protest scaling, my network scaling data doesn't overlap with the NAVCO data.
Yeah, I mean, there's if you shoot me an email later on, I can remind myself to kind of send it to you. But I think there's a couple of people that are trying to do some latent variable stuff with regards to a bizarre large composition of distinct data collection efforts. Which ones have participation rates in them, I'm not sure, but I know that they're up to 20 or 40 different data sets that they're pulling together. So someone's doing that. Not that you want to go this route, but some of the stuff that I had touches on networks, but differently. I mean, so I have stuff that's like individual membership in this kind of Black nationalist organization and who's co-present for meetings. And then subsequently with Chris Sullivan, we look at basically how repression affected subsequent responses as a function of who was co-present and who was connected to one another, and which of those were repressed and which one weren't. So we find that people that were co-present and repressed were the ones that showed up. People that were not co-present but still members of the same organization, after the repression, they didn't show back up. So it's a different take on the networking thing, but there's some that have moved in that particular direction that have gone back to kind of like organizational level information. And so that for me was kind of like one of my questions with regards to what are the alternative operationalizations for network. And I'll put co-presence at a meeting or living in the same geographic location up against some of this Twitter stuff. And so I think if you engage with that literature, then I think that's a little bit more, I'll be a little bit more comfortable. Ring Ramirez et al. Has a piece on kind of like diffusion of tactics across space, but they're effectively looking at co-presence at individual protests by distinct protest organizations. And then when these organizations go back to their separate spaces, they're kind of carrying the tactics with them. So it's a different way of looking at diffusion. But there's also, this relates to some of the stuff with the dynamics of collective action database. And I know some people are trying to kind of like improve that stuff now that all these historical sources have come out. And so I wouldn't throw the US out as a case as of yet. But also related to that kind of like, so I kind of want a deeper dive on the network stuff, discuss different ways to do it. I kind of want you to do a deeper dive to kind of go over the stuff by Bob Axtell and Ian Lustig and just kind of like bring people up to speed. I agree with Yuri in a sense that I was looking for that audience hook, and if it was us, then you have to kind of acknowledge how Axtell and Lustig and Hoover and Kowaleski and all these other people were treated and how they were viewed relative to the rest of the community, which wasn't always easy. I think you were right about some of it, right? Hoover and Kowaleski's piece was described at one point as like, a net that seemed to encompass seemingly everything. And so you're clearly away from that, but you're closer to Axtell and Lustig, but this is still very different from what the majority of people do in the community. So I think there's some contextualization and some historization that might prove useful for bringing your audience along about how these models have generally been viewed relative to others. We kind of have a open queue-ish dynamic, so people could just kind of come what they want to with comments. I have a bunch, but we could roll. And Yuri, you're not out, so you don't need to necessarily be quiet. So anybody who wants to go, let's just go. Erica, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, finding that protest is basically random, and a way to sort of leverage that demonstration to either support or critique other existing work. So on protest and repression in particular, because there's a really large literature that basically suggests either theoretically or empirically or both that repression should just sort of uniformly suppress protest. And there's lots of people that suspect that. Related to that literature is this idea that very powerful or closed political systems make it difficult to protest or make protest escalation into full-scale mobilization very unlikely, or that they basically presume that there are settings or contexts in which repression just deters protest, or the potential for repression deters protest. And I think you could argue against those kind of more skeptical interpretations of the protest repression nexus, and instead use your kind of network as intervening variable or conditional variable to really support other arguments out there that say, look, it really depends on the level of organization. So I actually think your findings are really consistent with like Wendy Perlman's work, arguing that cohesion among nationalist groups in Palestine and elsewhere makes it so that repression doesn't necessarily demobilize those movements, and in fact often can provide moments of more large-scale collective action. It certainly speaks to work by Jonathan Sutton, Charles Butcher, and Isak Svensson, who argue that one-sided violence against protests are effective when the protests are one-off, but they are very ineffective when the protests are part of a larger organized campaign. And, I think actually the findings speak to the sort of broader literature on the fact that, structural models, as you rightly mentioned in the study, are, they're not like determinative. They might shape the manner in which people protest or the flavor of protest or whatever, the flavor of repression, but they don't necessarily, as kind of a general matter, preclude or prohibit protest as a category of political action. and that in fact, the way that people kind of maneuver in their environments can be really strongly or really, really influential in determining, what comes next, which are kind of more agency-based approaches. And so, and your model is an agent-based model, right? So it presumes they're deciding. So in that sense, this is just kind of speaking again to sort of how you motivate the study in general, but I think that your findings have real implications for kind of weighing in on this active debate and really supporting a lot of literatures that exist out there.
Yeah, I want to jump in on supporting Erica's argument here. I mean, I think this is one of the more intriguing kind of like parts of this, but it also speaks to this. There's a huge resonance for that, right? So a lot of people were kind of like, okay, so repression has all these effects, and it's just like stated like it's a freaking statement. But a bunch of people have been pushing back. So Erica mentioned several. In my How Social Movements Die book, I'm arguing appraisal theory that the organization knew repression was coming, and if you know repression is coming, when it comes, you're not going to be affected in the same exact manner. So states switch up on the type of repression you're expecting. Then with Cyan and Chris Sullivan, we had a piece where basically we show that repression affects social movement mobilization in a sense, in accordance to where you are in the conflict cycle. So a bunch of people are now kind of trying to explain this crazy variation to show that it's not crazy, right? But related to that involves a kind of certain degree of specificity that I think would be very useful from your perspective. So notice many of the examples that I gave you were about social movement organizations, same with Wendy, right? And how repression perturbs the organization. You get a protest event, and so someone might be a member or someone might not be a member. So I think you should leverage that, because these connections don't seem to necessarily have to be in the context of an organization, right? You don't have to be a member. You could just be connected to one another through family or neighborhood or something like that. And so I think you could speak to different types of connections that maybe make that a little bit more explicit. But this relates back to a comment that Yuri was making, right? So you put Mandela under arrest and you shoot Biko and send him out of a window, right? So there's different types of people that are connected in different ways that might be likely to have some mobilization. And all this gets back to how, I know you're trying not to go there, like not to introduce another variable, but the differential effect of repression on what's being repressed, right? So if it's all about protest policing, then it behooves you to kind of speak to that specific kind of phraseology and narrow down the parameter. You say repression, I start thinking a couple of different things, some preemptive stuff, some stuff not at the event itself. That's why the police are taking pictures, right? So they know who's there, so they know whose houses to go to, which then involves something else. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I didn't mean to throw a bunch of stuff at you, but definitely I like the taking the bull on by the horns, basically, kind of like, okay, people are going, repression's going all these different ways. Here's the cataloging of those different explanations. And now let me show you how my network thing can actually navigate this space to help you understand it. I think that's a huge hook and contribution that would bring people along for the ride very readily.
Yeah, I appreciate all these literature mentions, because it's a lot of stuff that I don't read or haven't read in a while. So I need to go back and look at that or read these new things. And your point about what kind of repression I'm talking about is spot on. I'm interested in, once the protest starts, that the repression that occurs there. So that could be, locking up Navalny. I don't know if that's equivalent to locking up Mandela, but it's certainly equivalent to taking photos of protesters or blocking hospital entrances. The point is, I don't think there's the strategic component as much. It's much more tactical repression in the phase of protest and repression that I'm interested in. More epistemologically, I think the tools and maybe even causes that exist pre-protest. So by tools, I mean, how we would analyze them and how we would understand them before protest starts, and then once you're in a I don't want to say movement, because that implies longer term, but once you're in a protest event and a series of protests, right? Once you're in the 18 days in Egypt or Leipzig in '89, I think those are very different dynamics, and that's what I'm trying to speak to. is these very, temporally fine dynamics.
I mean, minor point, but clarification of language that would be very helpful. What you just said helped me contextualize the piece a heck of a lot better than I think it's currently structured. So you just gave me kind of like, here's the different points at which we could basically focus our investigations, and here's the variation that's coming off of that within the research. Mine is specifically tailored to this particular context, these particular activities, this part of the event sequence. That would be very helpful, I think, in terms of bringing people along.
Got it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yuri, I got a list.
Yeah. So Zach, what is the value added of experiments 1 and 2? If experiment 3 gives you the most interesting results, and and also there's the results for experiments 1 and 2 in terms of the distribution of equilibrium protest size look a little weird, right? So those models predict a lot of high participation events, almost to the point where the distribution looks not fat-tailed but bimodal. So there's a bunch of small protests, a lot of big ones, and nothing in the middle, whereas the distributions for experiment 3 look much more realistic.
Yeah, so the value added of 1 and 2, that's a fair question. I started, and this goes back to your comment about how I've kind of stepped you through what I did as opposed to kind of presenting the main result. I did experiment 1 because I wanted to make sure there is validity to the basic setup, and then experiment 2 to see if there's this variation with network scaling, and then 3 combines it. But as we're talking, it's clear to me that 3 is what I'm interested in, so maybe that's just what I should lead with. Now, in terms of the distribution perhaps being bimodal, this goes back to the thresholds that I was talking about. So I noticed exactly what you noticed, and it's because when you give everyone a threshold of 0.2, when you have like some poorly connected people, like maybe they only have 5 or 10 connections, it's very easy for them to mobilize, because they just need to see 1 or 2 people who mobilize, and so you get very high levels of participation most of the time. So I've subsequently drawn the thresholds randomly from a normal distribution, and you get a much smoother distribution of protest size, and so that's just a function of the threshold. If you were to make the thresholds 0.5 or 0.6, which I've done, then you get hardly any large protests. And again, this gets back to trying to go with a parsimonious model. Like, I would love to be able to measure what people's thresholds are. I emailed Granovetter and Taro and was like, are you aware of anything where people have tried to measure thresholds, and they couldn't, they didn't know anything. So then I didn't look. I said, okay, well, if they don't know, then I'm going to stop there. And anyway, yeah. So you're right that the current distribution doesn't look great in 1 and 2, and that's because of the fixed threshold of 0.2, and then it looks better in experiment 3 because repression, cuts away a lot of those ties. Christian, what you were talking about targeting, highly connected people, and this goes to Yuri's comment as well. I could make the probability of the repression occurring on a node, proportional to how many connections you have, right? So weight it by, the number of ties of a node compared to all the activated nodes. And so, on one hand, that's another parameter. I think that's easy to defend, and I don't think I would have to vary that in any sort of model. So that that would say you're not always. You put Mandela in prison, but you're not able to put MLK in prison, right? It wouldn't be deterministic.
I definitely like that, especially what I was missing over this was some assumption that the government's learning over time, right? And so you show up to a protest, you see who people are kind of cohering around, You follow those individuals, you acknowledge that they're really central to how this thing goes, kind of in line with what you're suggesting. And then you're kind of like, okay, we need to get this person out of here. And so one way is to kind of like, you know, remove them. And I think that's fair. But I started wondering about other things, right? So the state would not just to deal with the event. So you need to get me out of it's all about protest policing, right? So I'm just like, why wouldn't the state try to figure out how people are getting in, and then they're setting up blockades and making it harder to get in? Why aren't they going to their employers and then trying to get them fired to get them out? Why aren't they, and you mentioned some of this other stuff, right, that interferes with coordination, but I'm like, why aren't they doing these other things as well? And how do those other things influence the likelihood of your particular events kind of manifesting themselves? And thus I just found myself kind of, I guess you want to control my wandering mind of different repressive tactics, because I'm sitting there going, yeah, protest policing is one thing, but I think in the dynamics of collective action, the state is most likely to do nothing. So not show up at all is what's most frequent, and then presence is the second thing that's most popular, and then you have other activities that are taken. And so your kind of like removal thing, it seems to be, or you argue something about dispersal. And I was like, I don't know if that's accurate, but then also kind of tactically what happens if things get unruly, then other things are more likely to happen. And it could just be that the people that we selected to be here today maybe know a bit too much about the topic, because we could just keep spinning with different types of scenarios and start thinking about a bunch of different things tactically. And so I was like, okay, so you have me on protest policing, but I'm just like, why don't I show up before the event and make it hard to get to the event, or eliminate the leaders, or go for the nodes, or go for, well, they could do whatever they want to as long as they don't talk about X. And so those things then influenced how I thought this kind of like diffusion, spillover, contagion stuff happened. And so I think you need to kind of control my rambling mind a little bit. And it took me a while to figure out some of the modeling stuff and who I thought this was comparable to. And I'm just like, oh, I think Bob Axtell did some of this stuff. And I was then trying to find Axtell's work and see what he was doing, agent-based modeling out of Brookings. And I was like, oh, what was his modeling? And then I was trying to figure out what happened to those people, what happened to the modeling group, so as not to happen to your piece. And I think it was kind of like, some of it was speaking to some of these central questions. And I don't think they necessarily spoke to some of the central questions. And some of them were the startup to get you into that, right? You know, I start with differential equations. I'm ready to go there with you. And then you start going, and you know, this is my career more than your piece, right? So I'm ready to go there. And then many people weren't willing to go there. And then you kind of stop talking about that. And then you go to vector autoregression. Then you go to a bunch of different things to talk to people. Who are you talking to, and how are you able to bring people along, I think is in part kind of what Erica was suggesting about big pitch, big kind of like argument about kind of like where people have gone, what the limitations with that work are, where you can take us, what the limitations of your stuff are. And I think that in the next kind of go round, I think would go very far to helping me kind of better understand how I should go with you and where I could go with you and so forth. And so I felt similar to kind of like Yuri in a sense that as I read it, I felt I was your audience, but I felt that I wasn't in a sense. And so the jargon stuff would help as well, but also contextualization I think would be very useful. And just, I think we're at that point now where we're kind of like, all right, why are, because I had a piece with Cyan, the states must be crazy. They talked about, it was like, well, if states know that their efforts don't work, why are they still doing it? And so I know you try not to make it strategic, but it's hard not to kind of go there as well. So like, why keep going with this same tactic to these different events? And I wasn't getting some kind of growth across it. Erica.
Yeah, so on that, one question I had for you, Zach, is how hard would it be to introduce another option for the states, being concessions? So Christian mentioned, there's, most of the data shows that the state actually doesn't respond in any way to protests. Repression is an option, but so is concessions. And concessions actually can be just as demobilizing for some movements, because they end up like splitting the moderates from the radicals. And then you get, more kind of small scale, potentially destructive kinds of protests, which then, demobilize from there. So that was one kind of thought I had. Jonathan Pinkney just put out a monograph last year on what was called Making or Breaking Nonviolent Discipline, where he makes this point that actually, both repression and concessions lead to breakdowns in mobilization capacity, basically, because of this dynamic. And then the other thing I was thinking about is this question that Chris just brought up about why do states keep repressing, even if they know that it's highly politically risky and practically costly. And I think part of the reason for it, there's all kinds of internal reasons for it. Like part of it's like a loyalty probe or whatever. It gives them more information about what their kind of long-term capacity is to hold on to power or whatever. But another thing is just that if you draw on some of the like counterterrorism literature on this, like Ethan Bueno de Mesquita's stuff, for example, he argues that repression or repressive techniques are the most visible kinds. And so a lot of people who are in power use it just to demonstrate that they're doing something or they're trying to manage something, even if they know that it actually has a high potential for backfiring or whatever, that it's just the simplest and most visible technique that they can use to try to shore up what domestic support they can. And so I think, it's worth addressing, that there are existing arguments about why, we would observe this kind of repeated behavior, even if it appears non-rational from the state's perspective.
That's good. That's a good point.
Yeah, not to speak for Yuri, but he's got a piece that would kind of raise this issue of like, why not just send in like the gunship, right? Like most some of the crowd down. You have the state in responding in a very kind of they're not escalating really. They're just kind of like they're extracting some people, but they're trying the same tactic, right? Why not try just mow down 50 and see what happens?
Yeah, I could do that. I mean, I could have the level of repression itself be drawn from a distribution at each step of the game, of the simulation. I don't know a priori if that would lead to more large protests or not, right? Because then sometimes you'll have very little repression. But that's something I should consider.
But I interrupted you. You were about to respond to Erica.
Well, I was actually going to ask about measuring repression empirically. It's not a direct response. So I've also considered this, and so this goes back to Yuri's original comment about getting some empirics behind this. And as far as I'm aware of, like VDIM is basically the best that's out there, and it's these are still ordinal scales. And if in any model, in an empirical model, it would essentially be a fixed effect because you don't have any daily variation in repression in any published data set that I'm aware of. So I'm just curious if y'all are aware of anything that I'm missing, or if there's anything I'm missing, or if there's a better way of operationalizing it. One possibility, for example, would be to go to like machine coded events data like IQs, where there's they don't call it repression, but there's, like mobilized police. And you could see like how often the state's mobilizing police by day and call that repression, let's say. But then I would need daily measures of protest turnout again. Anyway, the point is I'm still just trying to think about how to empirically model this, and kind of stuck there.
Effectively by the event, right? So you need information that is. So my thing is, most of your repression is simply responsive to protests. So you don't have preemptive stuff like curfews ahead of time. Restrictions on assembly and association. You're not getting that. So you're talking about event-based stuff that is event-specific. Yeah. Which also, I mean, VDEM's not that either, right? So I didn't quite get that comment. But I mean, there's a bunch of, I mean, you're effectively going to have to go to distinct kind of subnational projects as you're trying to do. So Yuri and I and graduate student Nadia have this cross-sub thing where we're trying to pull together all these different subnational database projects. There's a subset of that concerns social movement behavior. And I think we probably have responses to that. That includes SCAD, but it also includes some others as well. I think Indonesia has something on protest policing. And so, I think, you might need to just kind of piece those together until
Right.
something more global is pieced together. Yuri, am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, well, there are multiple sources of protest data around the world, but what we do not have are estimates of protest size. So it's which is a problem, but I'm not sure that there's a ready-made solution other than just a few bespoke data sets that people have collected that Zach is already trying to get his hands on.
Mm-hmm. You know, Christian, you were talking about like other people who've done ABMs in the past and like why, you know, what happened to them, why hasn't gone anywhere. I don't have a good answer for that. What Fowler always told me, because when I was like doing my prospectus, I was considering ABMs, is that they were too complicated since they weren't analytic, like people didn't believe it. And so one, that motivated my decision to keep the model very simple. Two, like the tradition, like, you know, kind of the old school ABMs, it always happens on a grid, right? And like interaction is defined by some perimeter around each you know, agent in a cell. So like Josh Epstein has a 2002 PNAS piece that models, he calls it civil violence. You know, we would call it mobilization. But those don't have network. They don't have any concept of social networks, right? So they might have like a radius around each cell, but then they don't like vary that radius by cell. They don't have any way of introducing heterogeneous interactions, basically, right? Heterogeneous effects based on who you interact with. And so that's what I've seen in all the stuff that predates David Siegel's work. And then David is kind of interested in slightly different things. He's not interested in the fat-tailedness. He's kind of interested much more in the different types of network structures that you could have. And then he models like emotional thresholds. So that, you know, that's where I see that literature. I don't think there's any strong reason why ABM hasn't, like, you know, taken off. It doesn't have to, you know, be the sine qua non of approaches.
Yeah, my thing was from what I recall, like this is I remember having the conversations similar to yourself. I think I was looking at using like Professional Dynamo or Stella or something like that. And then Stuart Bremer had just come back with his Globus model. I mean, there was a bunch of people that were trying a bunch of different things. My whole thing was, I think it always came back to, okay, well, how well could you predict the world? Or how well could you explain to us what actually was happening? And then very few were actually making that comparison to some data to get us somewhere along the line. But there is some stuff in like networks and so forth and Soch, and I didn't see you necessarily engaging that. Craig Byerline comes to mind, but I think there's a bunch of people that are kind of like, if you go to Mobilization, the journal, or ASR, I think there's some decent network people. The criticism I've heard of that is it's mostly kind of like data packages and interesting ways to do it, but they have no theory. And so I think you'd be an interesting interface with kind of like intervening into that literature and that discussion. So there's great ways of kind of like modeling stuff and getting to centrality and so forth, but like getting from centrality to why you're going to see actual behavior look the way it is, that hasn't been as strong, but boy, they can measure centrality really well. And so it's interesting kind of literature across different social movements, right? So this takes you to a different level of analysis. These people are more interested in individuals and organizations, but I think that you clearly have a way of trying to scale that up. And I think that interface would be useful if you could make that intervention, because I think much of the repression stuff it's either directed towards crowds, it's directed towards an organization, or it's directed towards individuals. And you're kind of crossing those three, but it would be useful, I think, to kind of play out exactly how your approach is different from those three as foils, and actually maybe suggesting that your approach is actually linking the three, which I think would also be another way of thinking about your contribution. Because I kept thinking about, okay, well, why some of the repression stuff is off in terms of its impact, because we're conflating those three, right? We have nation level aggregated information. Okay, that's probably not the way they do it. Okay, social movement organization specific information. Okay, that's closer, but that's not the same thing as a mass protest. You think about like op and rule stuff, right? It's just kind of like that was about the people that showed up at Leipzig. Everybody, you're in the movement, you're not in the movement. Okay, that's very different. Or individual specific stuff. And your network stuff can link these 3 or 4 different things. You have to play that back to figure out how many I was talking about. But I think that would be useful to do, to try to then integrate and then show how these things could be done. And that, I think, would be like kind of a useful way to look at it.
Okay.
Cool. I see Erica nodding. I can't see Yuri because he wishes to be hidden. So I don't know what he's doing right now. But yeah. Oh, there you are.
I'm here. Actually, one data set that just came to mind that does have estimates for participation numbers is the replication data set for Mark Beisinger's 2002 book. The numbers are rounded to hundreds, but but they still have estimated numbers for about 5,500 protest events in the Soviet Union in the late 80s. And there's also data about arrests. So this does not allow you to test your theory fully, in that there's data on who the organizers of each protest were, but nothing along the lines of, network scaling or the other parameters that you do have. But but it's better than nothing. So that's I think it's on his website, and also if you can't track it down there, I can send it to you.
Okay, yeah, I'll check it down. Yeah, 2 other data sets that have come to mind are, Niels Weidman has this mass mobilization in autocracies, which I don't think will be public until his book comes out. So it'll be there one day. And then there's a SUNY Binghamton mass mobilization project that has I've downloaded their data. I haven't looked at it closely yet, but I know they have a participation size number, and so that might be useful for me as well.
They also have a state response variable that covers inaction, repression, and concessions, or accommodation of some sort. So, all of that is in there. I don't know if it's published yet or not. It's Dave Clark and Pat Regan who collected it. Yeah. And then the other data, country-specific data, that I think uses a really similar coding scheme to Beisinger's is Graham Robertson's data on Russia and protest that he used for his book called Protest in Russia. But I think it covers a couple decades of data and has participation figures and repression figures in it.
Okay. I've read his papers. I'll have to go back and try to find the data.
Yeah, I'm looking at the code book for dynamics of collective action, and evidently number of participants reported is variable 16.
Yeah. I've used dcals. That's how I pronounce it. For this other project, the same one that I've used NAPCO 3 for. So yeah, there's a lot of size data, but then it's not concurrent with my scaling data. And that's the problem I'm at right now. But I could get creative about how to measure network effects in these older periods.
Can I weigh in with the one finger?
Shoot.
So Zach, I was curious whether you might reflect a bit on what you think are the sort of normative or ethical implications of your work. So if I was an activist in any context, what would you want me to know? And do you think the results or the findings that you're putting out here are more helpful for sort of emancipatory purposes or for repressive purposes?
So if the main result is that given our state of knowledge, outcomes are closer to random than not, I want to say it's neither, right? So I would tell an activist not to give up hope, right? If you were sitting in East Germany in 1985, 1983, you'd probably think things are pretty hopeless. But the fact that things can happen kind of spontaneously and grow despite large scale repression means you have to you kind of have to be the spontaneity, right? You still have to. Sparks don't come from anywhere, they don't come from a vacuum, right? So I can't tell you this doesn't tell you to do something on this square or to get these 20 people, but it doesn't tell you to just do nothing. If I was a repressive actor, I mean, the stylized fact from experiment 3 is that, yeah, if you can remove 90% of participating edges, 95% participating edges, then you know that'll probably stop protests. There's a cost function there that I don't model though, and I'm not convinced that the high levels of repression in my model are actually feasible for any state, right? That requires significant mobilization of your police forces, probably your armed forces, the resources to pay them, some technological infrastructure to know who to target in the first place. I mean, so the repressive takeaway would be to like repress as much as possible, but I don't think that would guarantee a failure of protests. I mean, I think of anything, this is more negative for the repressive regimes than not. So one thing I want to do is try to measure scaling via Twitter across regimes, and then see if it varies. And like if there's not much variation, whether we're looking at Venezuela versus the U.S. or Zimbabwe versus France, then that kind of suggests that maybe maybe a dictator's time is limited, that the randomness means that he could stay in power 3 years or 30 years. But if no amount of curfews or banning unions or preventing, foreign civil society organizations, if none of that changes this underlying social network structure, then the randomness is bad for the regime.
Good answer.
All right, thanks.
So I'm kind of like, so if we buy your argument, then like size and network are the things we should be paying attention to. But then there's the part of me that's kind of like, well, what about claims, or the quality of the claim, or the objective that's being pursued? Media, both coverage and spin, and then tactical selection, right? There's a whole discussion out about like tactics. So you're not necessarily addressing that per se, but you're just kind of talking about protests. But I'm just like, well, there's occupation, but then you also talk about terrorism, and you also talk about kind of insurgency. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, because drawing upon kind of like Civil War insights and terrorism insights to apply to protest is kind of a stretch. Yeah. But then I'm wondering about the kind of like, size and network matters parts of your story, if you can figure that out for kind of like pushing us in terms of scope, right? So this probably matters for these types of topics, or these probably matter for these types of contexts, which you kind of leave out right now, but it seems like some of these findings concern some of these kind of like mobilization and repression and tactical selection things. I think of protests as a very specific domain relative to some of these other types of things, and both the terrorism and the insurgency issues seem to matter more for the concern that I raised before about having an organizational focus as opposed to an organization and civilian intersection focus. And maybe your research is speaking more to that intersection of those kind of contexts than it does specifically to an organizational oriented focus.
Yeah, okay, so size of networks, counterterrorism, civil war, and then like which level of analysis. So counterterrorism, civil war, I don't want to speak to that in this paper. So right, Yuri said the 9/11 example, it was out of context, and I think that's right. I have these visions of a few years down the road, expanding this, maybe in writing a book, trying to come up with a common framework for explaining fat-tailedness and protests, civil wars, and terrorism casualties, because they do exist in those other domains. But I'm not trying to do that here, so I need to trim it down. And then in terms of like the level of organization, whether talking individuals, social movement organizations, like nation state, et cetera, I think it's very much at the micro individual level that I'm interested in. So I liked your idea about how networks could operate across all of these levels, and that's often the promise given for network analysis. And I kind of believe that. I'm not really trying to model that though. David Siegel, one of his network typologies is hierarchical networks where there's just much clearer branching, and so you have like scaling, but like it's a tree that goes from each node, whereas mine is more randomly distributed. Anyway, the point is like that would be how I would capture that, and I'm not trying to do that in this model, so I don't think I get there. And then I'm not quite sure what you meant by size of network. Do you mean size of the initial protest, or just like how many nodes I've made
that was just a comment of the characteristics or dimensions of the events that you found to be important. So you have network kind of underneath the thing, and then you have size of the protest event itself. So, but that size was merely one characteristic of the event that you could pay attention to, right? So it's like the number of people that are showing up.
Oh, yeah.
The Clark McPhail sense, what those people are actually doing while they're there. And then what are those people asking for? But size was like one characteristic that you were paying attention to. And it seemed to be that size was important for some reason, but you weren't necessarily kind of speaking to why. Yeah,
so that's good. So this is a nice way for me to plug what I'm going to present at ISA and then another project I'm going over the summer. So anyway, I think so in the context of this paper, size matters because the larger the protest, the more likely the median policy preference of the protesters is. The median policy preference of the protesters is likely to be closer to the median policy preference of everyone, the larger the protest is. And the larger the protest is, that suggests the farther away the desired policy preference is from the prevailing preference. And so that's a very strong signal to the policymakers. I think there are, in the McPhail sense, a lot of other dimensions to protest aside from just size that matter. So in this work that I'm starting, I'm trying to measure, of course, the tactics that happen on a day-to-day level. So whether protesters choose violence or non-violence, as well as what I'm currently calling the demographics of protesters. So I think like the gender, what am I calling, like diversity, right? So whether it's like all male, all female, or some mixture, as well as I mean, right now, I'm saying like racial diversity because I'm thinking in like a U.S. context. In some like if I'm trying to measure like South Korean protests, like racial diversity is not a key concept. But the point is simply that the more diverse initial protesters are, I think people take that as a signal of the depth of grievances, and therefore the probability that the protest will grow in size, and therefore the probability that the cost will be low. And so the more diverse initial protesters are, the more likely a protest is to grow. I'm actually going off, like I'm kind of inspired by Suzanne Lohman's activist moderates framing, and I think that's what this demographic diversity can capture. So anyway, the main concepts I think that matter aside from protest size are this demographic diversity and the tactics that are chosen within a protest. But again, I'm still thinking about this day-to-day kind of individual level tactical dynamic. But I think that's outside the scope of this paper. But you should come to my ISA panel if you want to see more about that. Thursday, 10 o'clock, I believe.
Well placed, sir. Well placed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yuri E, we are open. I always have stuff. So. Related to your last comment, though, Zach, regarding the kind of diversity, because then you start making me think of kind of like the youth bulge stuff that there was money, but also the kind of like concept of biographical availability within the kind of movement literature, because that should have implications for the potential pool of individuals that could be drawn upon, right? So you might have network, but is that network offset by age of the population, acknowledging that if the biographical availability argument is correct, that this younger pool will be most responsive to those networks, and that right now your argument seems to be kind of agnostic to age, right? Or other types of kind of characteristics that could be less inclined to kind of pull you out to the street and so forth.
Yeah. So in the parsimony of this model, I think that all drives the threshold of an individual. And if we accept the heuristic that young people have lower thresholds, are more likely to protest, they agitate more, then that's saying they have lower thresholds. And so we can model that by changing the distribution of thresholds that I model, right? So right now, if I have a normal distribution where the mean is 0.22, well, we can make that normal distribution where the mean is like 0.15. So I don't, and this is good. I want to talk about this, like going back to the very beginning. I don't think this says that our current approaches, our concepts of demographics or youth bulges or whatever, throw out your pet idea, have no effect. I think that in the context of my model, they're going to have an effect through an effect on thresholds. And so youth bulge would mean there are more nodes with lower thresholds. That also means that natural resources, if I have a lot of oil, a lot of diamonds, will maybe increase thresholds because I can pay off, I can create civil service employees, or I can create gas subsidies or bread subsidies, and that raises thresholds. So right now I see everything working through the thresholds.
Does it make your model too complex though to have? You've seen these kind of like oddly shaped kind of graphs that give you the kind of distribution of ages within a population? And it's
the violin plots, right?
Yeah, I forgot what they're called, but I'm wondering if you had corresponding thresholds to each of the different age cohorts, if you actually had data on what the actual distribution of the population was in terms of age, given those thresholds, then you could come up with predictions of how many people would show up.
I would love to do that. Yeah. And so that's why I emailed Mark and Sydney. I would do that in a second, right? So when Yuri mentioned I chose 2.3, that was actually I'd randomly pulled 100 hours of my Twitter data from all countries and just measured the slope. And it also turned out that Damon Centola, when he was making some complex contagion models, he used 2.3. I think my slope was like 2.28 or something. So I just went 2.3. So the point is I chose that because it was empirically grounded. And I would gladly set thresholds that are empirically grounded. I'm just not aware of any empirics right now that do that.
Yeah, you're making me think there's I think there was some survey work that was done, and maybe this was reported in the mobilization, but actually Rory McVeigh would be a good person to ask rather than Sid or Mark, in part because since he's now edited mobilization and ASR, he's got like a better sense of kind of what people are doing. But I think if your question is specifically kind of like by age or by different demographic characteristics, what's the likelihood that you would like to kind of like join activities that are underway and so forth? I think some stuff has been like done on that, if that's part of what you might be interested in trying to get the threshold argument. But I think that there's some survey work that's done that speaks to that fairly well. Yeah, I was going to say call data would be kind of like reasonable, but I'm not sure how reasonable sometimes, but yes.
You said call data, or you said
call data up?
Oh, okay. Is he still active?
Yeah. Okay. I didn't think like Bert Kleinerman's was active for a while. Next thing you know, then someone dropped something. I didn't think Clark was Clark. I bother Clark every couple of months to get his data, but it's just like, you never know. He says he's writing something. So I think quite frequently, if someone goes dormant, that just means that they're just busily writing. That's the nicer spin.
Yeah. I'm actually meeting Bert in June. I'll be in the Netherlands. And so I told him I'll buy him lunch. So I'm going to ask him this stuff then. As well as, I don't know if you know, he's in Antwerp. I'm blanking right now. He's a sociologist. I want to say Stefage, but that's wrong. Stefan something. Anyway, another guy who does mobilization. Anyway, and I'm going to talk about thresholds. I
mean, it's bad in the sense that you have to be this archivist of sorts of different people's projects as you're trying to get there, because you'd like to think that these things would be put together, but they're not, and everyone would benefit from this effort. So thank you on behalf of the community. But it's annoying that it has to come to this, but I think if you start to pull enough of it together, then I think you might just make it easier for the rest of it to come forward. Because I think that people that are collecting this information, it just doesn't, I think the embargo logic that we have is just outpacing the sharing and collaborative logic that we need to have. So clearly, as you're doing this, signal and thank those people that are going there, but also use any public opportunity, your ISA panel, for example, anything, or this, to basically kind of like put out the call and say what you're looking for specifically and make it easy for people to find you so that you could do the assemblage that all of us would benefit from.
Yeah, this actually reminds me of, like the Eugene software or the New Gene, like what Paul Post and whatever at University of Chicago put together. And I think Yuri and Chris are putting together some stuff on subnational repression. And like if there was like a way to take all of the different protest databases and put them into a system that would allow us to access them in one place and do some cross-validation and other things, that would be a huge contribution. So I know you probably have the technical skills for that, Zach. I don't know if it's something that sounds like fun, but it would be a huge contribution to the field.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a way to get a published article that would get me towards tenure, sure, but I don't have time to just put on my website.
Zach, that's past the article, man. That's several articles. That's the New York Times bestseller, and that's everyone's gratitude that would be writing letters for you. So that would be the way to look that one up. Yeah.
Okay. But along these like gathering data sets, Ronald Francisco, he put together his big European mobilization data set, and I don't know if you've been to the website, but it's like from the 90s. But I had an RA download it, clean it, and she's merging in VDIM data. Anyway, so I think that'll be a really good resource. I couldn't even find his email address, and I emailed Indiana, and they never responded. So once that's available, I'm just gonna like post that on GitHub. Obviously saying it's his data that's just been cleaned and made updated. But that's kind of the main. Yeah, I've done that. Oh, and then Karen Rasler's Iran article. Also couldn't get in contact with her. But I had the same RA just look at the line chart of protest activities and kind of eyeball how many there were per week. Because the y-axis goes in increments of 5, and so it's I don't know if the right number is 32 or 33, but it's close enough. And so I've like digitized that. So yeah, like I'm doing this, and I think if you guys are working on similar things, there's probably a critical mass that we can push out.
That's perfect. Although anybody's gettable, man. We could still get to Ron. We could still get to. I mean, as Ron was completing stuff, he sent it to me. So there's a bunch of folks that we could basically get everybody's stuff from. And Karen, everybody's gettable. We can get to anybody if you need. So we just need to know the call, right? And so and then if we could post this stuff on the Conflict Consortium to get it started, I'm like more than willing to kind of facilitate that. Anything to help facilitate these type of efforts, but we need to kind of put these out, I think, a little bit more consistently. But I think that's a very useful enterprise. And I think you're right, as it relates directly to kind of like, tenure prospects and so forth. We're not necessarily jumping up and down about people taking these particular activities that we all benefit from, but we need to find some way to incorporate that into the algorithm by which we're, thanking people for what it is that they're doing. So we will try to work on that too.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's good. Good.
Cool. Nice, happy way to end. Thank you for taking a hit for the broader audience that will all benefit from it, right? So
yeah,
it's one of those
thanks for organizing this, Christian and Erica, and thanks Yuri for the comments.
Also have some written comments that I'll send along as well that I didn't get to here.
Yeah, okay. And we should mention that Nils Weidman and Thomas Zaitzoff also have sent or will send written comments along. They couldn't join us for the call, but they read the paper and wanted to make sure their contributions were credited as well.
Yeah, they've sent me their comments.
Perfect.
Great.
All good. Well, thank you very much for joining for the conversation. Zach, good luck moving forward, and definitely kind of like let us know how things are going and any follow-up questions, and we'll send along the stuff that we have. Thank you very much for coming. Erica, always a pleasure.
So Yuri, thanks, Yuri.
Yuri, see you later.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right, bye.
Zach.
Thanks, Zach. Good paper.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.